Margaret Taylor was 54 and had grown used to quiet mornings. Her small house in Portland sat at the end of a tree-lined street filled with sunlight and memories. Her son Ethan had moved to Chicago years ago, chasing his career and his own life. Her husband, Peter, had passed away long ago. What was left behind was a steady rhythm tea at 7, gardening by 9, and long evenings spent with a book that she sometimes didn't even read. She often told herself she was content. The world outside her window was enough. She kept busy volunteering at the library, helping neighbors, baking pies when loneliness crept in. But there were moments when she heard laughter from the street or saw couples walking hand in hand when something inside her quietly ached. She missed being seen. One afternoon, she was in the garden wearing her sun hat and old gloves, when the sound of a car door closing broke the stillness. She looked up, squinting in the sunlight. A tall man in a denim jacket walked toward her with a familiar smile. For a moment, she couldn't place him. Then it hit her. "Daniel," she said, surprised. "Hey, Mrs. Taylor," he said warmly, his voice deep and friendly. It's been a long time. Truly he had. Daniel was her son's best friend from high school. He used to spend entire weekends at their house, always polite and full of energy. Now he was grown, maybe in his early 30s, with a calm confidence about him. His smile was still boyish, though, and it brought back a flood of memories. "What brings you here?" she asked, brushing off her gloves. "I was visiting my parents nearby," he explained. "Ethan mentioned you still lived here, and I thought I'd stop by." "Hope that's okay," of course, she said, smiling. "Come inside, Daniel. You're always welcome." Inside, the house felt warmer with another person in it. Margaret poured him tea, the way she used to when he was younger. He told her about his life, how he'd become a physical therapist, how busy city life could be, and how much he missed small-town air. She listened, truly listened, her heart softening with every story. "So you're helping people walk again," she said. "That sounds rewarding." "'Tis," he replied. "But sometimes I miss this." He gestured around. Peace. Quiet. People who remember who you were before life got complicated. That line stayed with her. She realized how rare it was for someone to talk to her that way. Most people treated her kindly but distantly, like a polite older woman. But Daniel looked at her like she still had stories worth hearing. After tea, she offered to show him her garden. It had always been her sanctuary. Roses, lavender, tulips, all carefully planted by her hands. Daniel followed, admiring the flowers, asking questions about the soil and weather. As she reached to pull a stubborn weed, her foot slipped slightly. Before she could steady herself, Daniel stepped forward and caught her by the arm. His touch was firm, reassuring. "Careful," he said with a half smile. "You've got to bend your knees a little when you do that. Keeps your balance better." She laughed, embarrassed but touched. "Thank you, doctor," she teased. He grinned. Occupational habits. The moment was small, ordinary even, but something about it lingered. The way he said it, "bend your knees a little," wasn't flirtatious. But it reminded her she still had a body that could move, hands that worked, and a heart that responded to warmth. They continued chatting while he helped her pick vegetables from the corner patch. The sunlight filtered through the trees, and their shadows moved together across the garden. When they went back inside, Daniel insisted on helping her wash the vegetables. "You always spoiled us when we were kids," he said. "It's my turn now." "Ah," Margaret smiled. It had been years since someone had offered her help so naturally. They talked for another hour, laughter filling the kitchen. He asked about Ethan, and she told him how proud she was, but also how quiet the house had become since her son left. Daniel nodded, understanding without pity. As he prepared to leave, he paused by the door. "It was really nice seeing you again," he said. "You too, Daniel. You're welcome anytime." "I might take you up on that," he said with a grin before stepping outside. When his car drove away, the silence felt heavier. Margaret stood by the window for a moment, watching the sun dip behind the trees. Something about the day had unsettled her in a good way. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. That night, T sat in her favorite chair, a cup of tea in her hands. The memory of Daniel's easy smile, still fresh. She told herself it was just a pleasant surprise, nothing more. But as she replayed the moment in the garden, the way he steadied her, the warmth in his voice, she felt something gentle stirring inside. Over the next few days, she found herself thinking about their conversation. It wasn't attraction, not really it, was connection. The kind that makes you remember who you used to be. The following weekend, Daniel texted her. "Hope you're well, Mrs. Taylor. Mind if I drop by to check that garden again?" Her heart skipped a little. She typed back, "Of course, anytime." When he arrived, he brought along a small wooden planter box. "Thought you could use this for your herbs," he said. "That's so thoughtful, Daniel." "You didn't have to. I wanted to," he said, looking at her with a sincerity that made her blush slightly. They spent the afternoon together planting, laughing, sharing bits of their lives. Daniel told her about his parents' recent move, about how he was thinking of opening his own clinic one day. She listened, feeling proud of the young man he'd become. But every now and then, she caught him glancing at her not inappropriately, but with a quiet tenderness that felt new. It was as if he saw the parts of her that had been dormant for years, the curious, warm, hopeful parts dotted at one point while they were rearranging flower pots. Margaret bent to lift one and felt a small pull in her back. "Oh, I think I twisted something," she said, wincing. Daniel immediately crouched beside her. "Here, let me help," he said softly. "Don't strain yourself. Just bend over a little slower next time, okay? You've got to protect your back." His tone was professional, caring, and yet, it carried something more, a kind of concern that went beyond politeness. She smiled faintly. "Always the therapist, huh?" "Always," he said, meeting her eyes for a moment longer than necessary. That night, after he left, Margaret felt both peaceful and restless. There was something about Daniel that unsettled the quiet she had built around herself. He made her remember that life wasn't supposed to be lived only in memories. She didn't tell Ethan about Daniel's visit. She wasn't hiding. It just felt personal. Like something fragile that only she could understand. Days passed, but Daniel continued to check in. Sometimes he'd send a picture of a plant and ask, "Would this grow in your garden?" Sometimes he'd bring coffee and join her for a short walk. It was all simple, harmless. Yet every moment carried a quiet sweetness that filled the empty corners of her days. Margaret caught herself humming again while cooking, smiling at her reflection while brushing her hair. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed the feeling of being noticed, not for her age, but for her presence one evening as she sat outside watching the sky turn orange. She remembered Daniel's voice, gentle, steady, saying, "Bend over a little when you pull the weeds." She had laughed at the time, but now she understood the meaning beneath it. It wasn't about posture. It was about slowing down, finding balance, learning to trust again. Her heart wasn't racing with infatuation. It was waking up to something simpler: companionship, kindness, possibility. When she finally went to bed that night, she didn't feel lonely. She felt alive. For the first time in years, she looked forward to tomorrow. She didn't know what Daniel's visits meant or where they might lead. But she knew one thing: everything inside her had quietly changed. And though no one else would understand, she knew that simple moment in her garden when her son's best friend said, "Bend over," was the beginning of something she hadn't felt in years. Not love yet, but hope. After that first visit, Daniel began coming over more often. At first, it was casual checking in on Margaret's garden, bringing small gifts like a new watering can or packets of seeds, always with that warm, easy smile. But gradually, their visits became longer, filled with laughter, conversation, and moments that lingered longer than they should have. Margaret found herself looking forward to the sound of his car pulling into the driveway, the sight of him stepping out, casual and confident, yet somehow still familiar. One afternoon, Daniel arrived with a basket of fresh fruit from the farmer's market. "Thought you might like these," he said, holding out the basket. Margaret accepted it, feeling a strange thrill at the gesture. It wasn't expensive, not a grand display, but it carried thoughtfulness and care that reached her heart in ways she hadn't felt in years. They set the basket on the kitchen counter and sat down with cups of tea. letting the quiet of the house settle around them. The conversation flowed easily, as if the years had melted away. He told her about his new job responsibilities, his small successes, and his challenges. Margaret shared stories of her volunteer work, the books she'd read, and little anecdotes about Ethan that made Daniel chuckle. It was comforting, natural. And it reminded her how long it had been since someone truly listened to her. Days passed, the subtle connection between them grew. There were no bold declarations, no romantic gestures. Just a steady rhythm of shared moments that felt intimate in a quiet, profound way. Margaret realized she had begun thinking about him often, wondering when he would come by next, how his voice sounded over the phone, how his laughter made the corners of her home feel warmer. One rainy evening, as storm clouds rolled in over Portland, the power went out unexpectedly. Margaret lit a few candles, their soft glow casting long shadows across the living room. She debated whether to call Daniel, then shrugged and picked up her phone. He answered immediately, calm and steady, and when she explained the situation, he offered to stop by until the storm passed. By the time he arrived, rain streaked the windows, and the world outside felt small and distant. They sat at the dining table, candlelight flickering between them. The storm rumbled softly, yet inside, the house felt like a cocoon. Neither spoke at first, just letting the quiet and the presence of each other fill the room. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice low and measured. "Mrs. Taylor, I've always felt like family here. But lately, I realize it's more than that. I don't know how to say it properly, but I care about you more than I should, maybe. And I felt like I needed to tell you." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She looked at him, searching his eyes for any hint of jest, but found only sincerity, respect, and a tenderness that made her pulse quicken. "Daniel, this is unexpected," she said softly, unsure how to continue. She felt warmth spreading through her chest, a mixture of confusion, hope, and curiosity. "I know," he said quickly, "and I don't want to make things awkward or uncomfortable. I wanted to be honest with you." Margaret considered his words. There was no pressure in his gaze, no rush, only honesty. And for some reason, that made it feel safe, even thrilling. She realized she had been craving something like this, someone who saw her, not as Ethan's mother or a widow, but as Margaret Taylor, full of life and warmth. The storm continued outside, the rain tapping against the roof. But inside, time seemed to pause. Margaret realized that her days of quiet solitude had been comfortable but lonely, and Daniel's presence had begun to shift something inside her, a subtle awakening she hadn't expected at this stage of her life. Over the next few weeks, Daniel's visits became more frequent. Sometimes they were for coffee and conversation, other times for walks around the neighborhood or help in the garden. Margaret noticed how naturally he made her laugh, how easily he could lift her spirits with a kind word or a shared memory. She found herself feeling lighter, more alive, and more hopeful. One afternoon, while they were rearranging pots and planting new flowers in the garden, Margaret bent to lift a heavy planter. Daniel immediately crouched beside her. "Here, let me help you," he said gently. She felt the warmth of his hands steadying hers and realized how comforting his presence had become. "Don't strain yourself. Just bend over a little slower," he added, with that same soft humor from their first meeting. She smiled faintly, a blush rising to her cheeks. "You've been teaching me about bending and balance for weeks now," she teased. "Occupational habit," he replied, meeting her eyes with that quiet intensity that made her chest flutter. Margaret laughed softly, but inside a storm of emotions swirled. She wasn't just aware of him anymore. She felt seen, appreciated, and cherished in ways she hadn't felt in decades. And every time their hands brushed or their eyes met just a second too long, her heart reminded her that this was more than friendship. One evening, Daniel invited her for a walk by the river. The sky was painted in shades of pink and gold, and the gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers. They walked side by side, not touching, but the closeness was tangible. Margaret noticed how protective he seemed, subtly guiding her steps over uneven patches of sidewalk, offering an arm when she needed it. "Do you ever think about how life changes?" he asked quietly, watching the water ripple in the fading sunlight. All the time, she replied. Sometimes I feel like life is just moving on without me. You're not invisible, he said, turning to look at her. I see you, the real you, and I think maybe it's never too late to feel alive again. Margaret's breath caught. His words weren't grand or dramatic, but they struck a chord deep inside her. She felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Possibility, hope, and even excitement. She realized that Daniel's visits had done more than fill her days. They had awakened a part of her heart that had been dormant for too long. As weeks turned into months, their bond grew stronger. They shared meals, stories, and quiet evenings filled with comfortable silence. Margaret felt herself smiling more, laughing more, and noticing the small joys of life again, the way sunlight hit her living room in the morning, the smell of fresh soil in her garden, the sound of Daniel's laughter echoing in her home. One rainy night, when the wind rattled the windows and the power went out again, they sat by candlelight talking about dreams, regrets, and hopes for the future. Margaret felt a calm she hadn't known she'd been missing. Daniel's presence wasn't overwhelming. It was grounding. He made her feel valued, alive, and seen. As he prepared to leave that night, he looked at her with a gentle seriousness. I don't want to rush anything, Margaret, he said softly. I just want you to know. I care about you. I hope you feel it too. She nodded, unable to find words, but feeling a warmth spread through her chest. I do, she whispered. After he left, she stood by the window, watching the rain blur the streetlights. She smiled faintly, realizing that something inside her had changed forever. She wasn't just a mother or a widow anymore. She was Margaret Taylor, a woman who could still feel joy, anticipation, and maybe even love again. That night, as she went to bed, she felt a quiet excitement for the days ahead. She didn't know what the future held with Daniel, but she knew one thing: her heart had begun to awaken. The small, innocent words he had said in her garden, "Bend over a little," had been the start of something far deeper. Something that reminded her that life could surprise her. Even at 50-4, Margaret drifted to sleep feeling lighter, warmer and alive, knowing that everything had changed. And that change had come in the form of laughter, kindness, and the quiet, steady presence of someone who truly saw her. She realized that life didn't have to be lonely or predictable. It could be full of new beginnings, emotional connection, the gentle promise of hope that had been waiting for her all along. And in that thought, she smiled. Because for the first time in years, her heart was no longer asleep. It was awake, curious, and ready to embrace whatever came next.